There is more than 200 autofocus full-frame lenses for Sony E-Mount, and you can easily get lost in those numbers. So here is my list of top 3 lenses for each category you see on the screen, and I've reviewed at least one of top 3 lenses in each category. Let's go! In this video I'm gonna be looking at autofocus lenses only, because otherwise this video would have been too long. And there are too many manual lenses on the market, and definitely not all lenses made their way to this list. So feel free to add your favorite options down in the comment section below. Also, each category will contain 3 lenses for different budgets: top-notch, best bang for a buck, and a budget option. And finally, in the end of the video, I'll show you my top 3 lenses all-around kit that will cover a lot of any videographer's needs. So let's start off with an ultra-wide-angle prime lenses. Sony 14mm f1.8 G Master for $1,500. So the first ultra-wide-angle lens on this list gave me some outstanding shots, as you can see on the screen right now, and to be honest, I really enjoyed using it. It's lightweight, compact, super sharp even wide open, perfect autofocus. You can even get some bokeh with this lens on such a wide angle. But there are 2 main drawbacks that make me worry. The first one is obviously the price tag. It's not an all-around lens, and you gotta justify the price for your particular applications. And the second one is the inability to mount filters on the front of the lens. Instead, it has a tiny rear proprietary filter slot on the back, so it's another pain in the ass. But all in all, the best ultra-wide-angle fast prime lens for Sony full-frame cameras as for now. In this video, I'll be using some tests made by Christopher Frost, so huge shout out to him for his amazing job. Sony 20mm f1.8 G, $800. 20mm is still a pretty wide angle, and in my humble opinion, it's more than wide for most applications, even for the real estate videos or shooting architecture. This 20mm G lens is twice as cheap as the first lens we've talked about, but it's still sharp, has almost no distortion, it's tiny and lightweight, has the same aperture of f1.8, so it's great in low light and some out-of-focus backgrounds while vlogging or close focusing. And speaking of vlogging, 20mm is a perfect focal length for it. So if you don't need a focal length wider than 20mm on a full-frame camera, this lens is the first prime to consider. Samyang 14mm f2.8 AF, $550. But if you do need a cheaper AF prime lens with wider field of view, you may consider this Samyang third-party lens. The price of it is really attractive, but you'll run into some issues with front filters, and also optically it has much more compromises than any of the Sony lenses mentioned before. And it's slower, being f2.8. The autofocus performance would be also worse, but if the budget is tight and 14mm with autofocus is a necessary part for your kit, put an eye on this Samyang lens. So now let's get into the ultra-wide-angle zooms territory. Sigma 14-24mm f2.8 DG-DN Art, $1,400. If you want to have the versatility of an ultra-wide-angle to wide-angle lens, still quite fast aperture, decent autofocus performance and good sharpness, and you have the budget, this Sigma DG-DN is a great option. But again, you can only use proprietary filters from the rear part of the lens, which is a bummer to me. And also is pretty heavy at 800 grams. Other than that, a great lens that covers a lot of wide-angle needs. Tamron 17-28 f2.8, $800. That's my personal wide-angle lens of choice, and I love its simplicity, but still great sharpness, fast aperture, and the focal length are pretty useful to me. 17mm on full frame is already super wide, and 28mm is almost not showing any distortion. I'm fine with this reach. Also, it zooms in and out internally, so it's a perfect lens for gimbal work. It has a great value and is lightweight too. Sony 16-35 f2.8 G Master, $2,000. The most expensive ultra-wide-angle lens in my list. It's quite old, and to be honest, I think that in a year or two Sony's gonna update it with the Mark II version. The 16-35 at f2.8 is a super useful focal range, and of course it's optically better than the Tamron lens. But paying more than twice as much, also getting much bulkier and heavier lens, is a matter of your personal preference. I would still pick the Tamron lens for incredible value. So now let's move on to more traditional standard zoom lenses. Sigma 24-70 f2.8 DG-DN for $1,100. The Sigma lens is truly a bestseller because you get like 85% of a G Master lens for less than half the price. The Sigma is slightly less sharp and the autofocus wouldn't be as snappy, but very decent. The only downside of this lens to me is the size and weight, 835 grams, which is quite substantial. Highly recommend checking out this lens. Sony 24-105 f4G OSS for $1,300. This is a one-stop darker lens, but it compensates it with built-in image stabilization or OSS and 35 extra millimeters on a tighter end. It's super useful for documentary type of shoots or filming events, and it's not that heavy, being 663 grams. So I'm totally fine with f4 aperture, considering that most modern full-frame Sony cameras can easily shoot usable footage at even 12,800 ISO. And the price is also reasonable. If you need more reach and optical stabilization, that's a perfect lens for you. Sony 24-70 f2.8 G Master Mark II, $2,300. This is hands down the king of 24-70mm range and definitely the best lens I've ever reviewed. Outstanding sharpness, almost zero distortion, minimal chromatic aberrations, superb minimal focusing distance, and great autofocus. It's also much smaller and lighter than the first generation of this lens, but the price? Ouch! If money is not an issue or you need only one lens to do it all, that's the one. And honorable mentions: Tamron 28-75 f2.8 Mark II. It's much sharper than the first generation, and if you are willing to sacrifice 4mm on the wide end, it's also a very popular standard zoom option. Do recommend. Non-standard zoom lenses. Tamron 20-40mm f2.8, $700. This Tamron lens has a pretty unique focal length, and if you shoot real estate, gimbal work, or do street photography, it's a very decent option to consider. It's super compact, lightweight, sharp, has minimal distortion, and fast and reliable autofocus. It might not be a lens for everybody, but if you do need those focal length with a fast f2.8 aperture, you cannot go wrong with this lens. Sony 20-70mm f4, $1,100. This is a relatively fresh lens from Sony and I didn't try it out yet, but it seems like a great replacement for Sony 24-70 f4 lens. You do get much wider shot, it's still super compact, and it seems like it's a perfect lens for traveling. I would be more than fine with taking only this lens to my vacations. Of course, some people consider f4 to be slow and afraid of mediocre low-light performance, but in my experience, constant f4 aperture is more than okay to get some nicely out-of-focus backgrounds, especially at 70mm. And with all modern Sony full-frame cameras, you get outstanding low-light performance, as I said before, so I would not worry too much. And since my Sony a7S III camera and 24-70 f4 lens was stolen in Italy a couple of months ago, I think when I buy my next full-frame camera, I'll get this 20-70 f4 lens as my all-around lens. But as for now, I shoot on my APS-C Sony FX30, so let's move on. Tamron 35-150 f2 2.8 or Samyang with the same focal length for $1,900 and $1,400 respectively. Before I got dropped, I really was considering this Tamron lens to be in my kit with the Sony a7S III. I did a lot of research about this lens and in my opinion it has only two major flaws, the size and the weight. If you don't care about it and you want to replace like 3 lenses with one, this Tamron lens 35-150 f2 2.8 is a no-brainer. The cool thing is that Samyang recently put out an almost identical lens with extremely close optical performance for $500 less, so there are at least 2 options for you to choose from. I hope Tamron is going to release some other interesting lenses with unusual focal length and fast apertures. Tamron 28-200mm f2.8 f5.6 for $730. Remember when I said that the 20-70mm f4 lens is great for traveling? This Tamron lens is much cheaper, has faster aperture on the wide end, and the reach is much bigger. I really enjoyed my time in Oslo, Rome and Nice with this lens. The 28mm focal length is fine for me, and on 200mm even with 5.6 aperture you still get a lot of creamy bokeh and great background separation. One more cool feature of this lens is a very close minimum focusing distance, and to be honest, for the price and versatility, I have nothing to complain about. Highly recommend it. So now let's talk wide-angle prime lenses, starting with 24mm. Sony 24mm f1.4 G Master for $1,300. I have really good memories about this lens because I reviewed it in beautiful Morocco and even did some astrophotography in Sahara Desert. This lens is very famous for its super epic B-roll footage by Peter Lindgren. Shout out Pete. And all in all, it's a supreme lens that has almost zero flaws. It's clinically sharp, the bokeh is beautiful, almost no chromatic aberrations, good flare performance, perfect compact size and low weight. 24mm is just not my cup of tea. I love 35mm, but if you have the budget and you need a 24mm fast prime, that's the best option Sony has to offer. Sigma 24mm f1.4 TGDN, $800. If you want a very similar performance but the budget is a bit too tight, this lens is for you. Sigma lenses are usually a little bigger and heavier and also a bit weaker optically, but I don't think that you'll be able to notice the difference with the naked eye. Sigma did a great job with their fast prime lenses and you can't go wrong with this lens. Tamron 24mm f2.8 macro for $200. This is by far the cheapest autofocus 24mm f2.8 lens on my list, and for the money it's just a super cool lens to have in your kit. It's so lightweight that you wouldn't even notice it in your backpack. And if you want to have just a simple compact setup for gimbal work or street photography, it's great. Its sharpness and autofocus performance is also decent enough. If you have an extra $200 laying around, why not to consider this Tamron lens? 35mm Sony FE 35mm f1.8 for $650. That was hands down my favorite lens of all times. Tiny, sharp, beautiful autofocus backgrounds, almost macro-like minimum focus and distance, low chromatic aberrations, and perfect autofocus performance. So sad that this lens was also stolen with a backpack. I miss it. But I can 100% recommend this lens to all Sony shooters, because in my opinion it's one of the best, if not the best prime lens for Sony full frame cameras for the money. Sigma 35mm f1.2 for $1,500. If you want to go all in on fast aperture, this behemoth is a lens to consider. To be honest, I would not buy this lens because of its size and weight and a really high price tag. But the images you get from it, and especially the bokeh quality, is outstanding. It's cool that Sigma showed off their capabilities in lens manufacturing, but to me it's a bit overkill. Sony 35mm f1.4 G Master for $1,400. If you wanted to spend $1,500 for f1.2 Sigma, why don't you consider much smaller, lighter, and even optically better G Master lens? At launch it had one major issue: enormous focus breathing, but now almost all Sony cameras have focus breathing compensation feature, so it's much more appropriate for video shooters. Other than that, it's an awesome lens and I can highly recommend it. 50mm Sony 50mm f1.2/f1.4 G Master for $1,900 or $1,300. Well, to be honest, I didn't fall in love with the 50-1.2 at first because it was bulky and heavy, but I adore its image quality and I think I shot one of my most beautiful wedding videos with it. It is a bit too expensive in my opinion, and Sony decided to release a much more affordable and also more compact f1.4 version, and I think it's a sweet spot for gorgeous images with reasonable pricing and yet rather manageable size and weight. And I do consider this lens when I buy my next full-frame camera. Sigma 50mm f1.4 DGDN for $850. Remember my words about Sigma 24mm lens versus GM lens? The same applies to 50mm f1.4 Sigma. Bigger, heavier, a bit worse optically, especially in terms of chromatic aberrations, but you do save a pretty good amount of cash. But to be honest, I would save up and go for f1.4 GM. Sony 55mm f1.8 for $900. And let's not forget about good old super compact 55mm f1.8 lens, which you can buy second-hand with a great discount and still get it in good condition. I just don't think it's worth buying brand new. Now let's talk 85mm. Viltrox 85mm f1.8 Mark II for $400. This Viltrox lens is one of the best 85mm bang for buck, not only for Sony E-Mount but also for instance for Nikon Z. And since in the same backpack that was stolen from us in Italy, I had the wife's Nikon camera and 3 Nikon lenses including 85 f1.8, we decided that her next 85mm lens would be from Viltrox, because I really enjoy the optical performance of it. It's sharp, it has beautiful bokeh, the autofocus performance is good too, it has reasonable weight, and all in all, for $400, it's really hard to find a better option. Yongnuo 85mm f1.8 DF STM $345. This Yongnuo lens for even lower price than Viltrox is considered to be one of the sharpest 85mm on the market in general. Of course, it has some flaws like the build quality isn't great, and the autofocus performance is not that reliable as with the Sony native lenses. But still, it's really impressive and worth your consideration. And 3 more lenses in the same category: Zeiss Bodies 85mm f1.8, Sigma 85mm f1.40 GDN, and Sony f1.4 G Master for $1,100, $1,100, and $1,700 respectively. And if the budget is not tight at all, have a look at those 3 options. Zeiss Bodies is the smallest one, and I owned this lens for almost 5 years and had no issues with it whatsoever. But if you want to have some extra blurriness in your background and a bit more light to hit your camera's sensor, Sigma and Sony GM giant lenses will give you a very expensive looking image. I'm just not a huge fan of bulky lenses. And the G Master is also very expensive, no matter it's a very old lens already. Now let's talk telephoto lenses. Tamron 70-180 f2.8 for $1,100. This Tamron lens made me want to use telephoto lenses again. Thanks to its compact size and low weight, it was a pleasure to use during our trip to Istanbul, Turkey. And just look at those shots, guys, it provides you with some amazing results. The difference between 180mm and 200mm is really negligible, and the absence of built-in stabilization didn't bother me a lot, because Sony a7S III IBIS system was more than fine for even shooting handheld. It also has almost macro-like minimum focus and distance, and all in all you get a lot of fun when using this lens. Highly recommended. Sony 70-200 f2.8 GM OSS Mark II for $2,800. If you want the absolute best 70-200 f2.8 lens that costs more than most Sony cameras themselves, here it is. Image stabilization, sharp as Japanese chef knife. Relatively compact and lightweight if you compare it to other stabilized 70-200 f2.8 lenses from different manufacturers. Flawless AF performance, and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that even 1% of my colleagues can justify this price. You're lucky if you can. Sony 135mm f1.8 G Master. $2,100. This lens is a creative beast. Just look at those shots and amazing bokeh. I used to own a 135mm f1.8 lens back in 2016 and I wasn't using it too often. But when I did, the results were always amazing. It was by Samyang, by the way. This GM lens is a bit on the heavier side of things and is definitely very pricey. But if you do portrait photography for a living, you may consider this one. Now let's talk super-telephoto lenses. Sony 200-600mm f5.6 6.3 for $1,900. That was a fun lens to use because I took it to an actual football game and I was able to take some unique shots, as you can see right here. It's not that big and heavy as it might seem at a first glance, and the price is also pretty reasonable. It's great for sports, wildlife, reportage, has reliable autofocus, good minimum focus and distance, and pretty bokeh. And the reach that you get with 600mm is also very impressive. I'll leave a link to my full review down below if you want to learn more. Sigma 150-600mm f5 6.3 for $1,450. For less cash than the previous Sony lens, you get even brighter maximum aperture and 50mm wider focal length. There are some caveats with this Sigma lens, like autofocus performance is not as reliable as with the Sony lens, but all in all, it's a great telephoto option. Tamron 50-400mm f4.5 6.3 $1,300. One of the latest Tamron releases and such a unique combination of focal length. The versatility of it is just driving me crazy. Imagine you are on a basketball game in the first row. You could take a picture of a player right next to you with almost full body portrait. And in some time you could make a detailed shot of a basket. Wow. And it's really compact too, for 400mm lens at least. The major issue with this lens is that it's pretty slow, and if you want to shoot indoors, like the basketball game I've mentioned before, your ISO setting will be a lot higher. A very interesting option. So now it's time to reveal my pick on the best kit of lenses. Let me give you two options. First, Tamron 17-28 f2.8 plus Tamron or Samyang 35-150 f2.8. Those two lenses will cover huge focal length, relatively affordable, and pretty fast too. The combo of Tamron and Samyang will set you back $2,200, which is a very reasonable price for such a versatile setup of autofocus full-frame lenses. For the second kit, I would pick Sony 20-70mm f4 lens as my all-around go-to lens, and I'm pretty fine with 20mm as the widest focal length I have. Also, I would pick Sony 35mm f1.8 or Sony 50mm f1.4G Master as my creative and fast lens for better background separation and better low light performance. Plus, Tamron 70-180 f2.8 lens would be a great telephoto option with macro capabilities and relatively low weight. The whole set of those three lenses, if you pick 35 f1.8 instead of 50GM, will set you back $2,850, which is the same price as a single 70-200 Sony G Master Mark II. Your mileage may vary depending on your needs and budget, of course. Here it is, guys. I hope after watching this video you have much less questions about which full-frame autofocus lens suits your particular needs the best. If you did enjoy this video, smash the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notifications bell. Here is a video about APS-C autofocus lenses for crop sensor Sony E cameras for you to watch next. See you in the next video, guys. Take care. Bye.